Hello, friends. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we step quietly into deep time. You've arrived at the hominin history hub, soft science, gentle narration, and slow storytelling for anyone trying to rest their thoughts. Here, discoveries aren't shouted, they're listened to. We trace fossils like old memories, follow genes the way you follow a whisper in a dark hallway, and watch evolution unfold with the patience it's always had, one calm moment at a time. Picture this: a human skull hidden in the blackness of an old well, not buried by erosion or chance, but placed there deliberately. It was 1933, in the city of Harbin in northeastern China, where a bridge was rising over the Songhua River. The region was under Japanese occupation, and among the laborers was a man who stumbled upon an ancient human skull, an object he instantly understood was extraordinary, something precious, something he believed should never be claimed by occupying forces. So, in a quiet act of courage, he wrapped the skull in cloth, lowered it into an abandoned well, and walked away. He kept the secret for the rest of his life. Only when age began to close in did he share the truth with his family, that beneath layers of dust and memory, an artifact from humanity's deep past had been waiting in the dark. When scientists finally retrieved the skull in 2018, it had survived 85 years in silence. But the story it carried had been waiting far longer, nearly 150,000 years before it was touched by human hands again, and its return would send ripples through the field of human evolution, challenging one of our oldest assumptions, that the origins of humankind were simple, singular, and easily mapped. What rose from that well wasn't just a fossil, it was a riddle wearing a human face. It came to be known as the Harbin cranium, or, more poetically, Dragon Man. It was enormous, larger than modern human skulls, with a brain volume equal to or slightly greater than ours. Heavy brow ridges framed a face that was unexpectedly delicate. It was a mixture of traits, some primitive, some modern, that didn't fit neatly into any known branch of our species. For a while, it sat quietly in collections, labeled as an archaic human, maybe an oversized Homo erectus, a distant cousin. But when researchers finally studied it in detail, they realized this was something entirely different. Radiometric dating placed it somewhere between 146,000 and 309,000 years old. A wide range, but enough to place it within a chaotic, overlapping era of human evolution. This was not the dawn of Homo sapiens or the twilight of the Neanderthals. It was a moment when multiple kinds of humans walked the earth at the same time, sharing tools, genes, and perhaps brief encounters across icy plains. Scientists described features that matched no other known group. The eye sockets were large and almost square. The cheekbones sat flat and forward. The nose was broad. The jaw powerful, but missing the distinct chin that defines modern humans. It looked ancient, yet unsettlingly familiar, like evolution had sketched the human face again and again, revising and refining until it reached something recognizable. Its discoverers suggested it might represent a new species, Homo longi, the dragon man. Others disagreed, wondering if it was simply another puzzle piece in an already crowded branch, perhaps Denisovan, perhaps something between known categories. But everyone agreed on one thing: its significance was enormous. To researchers like Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London, the Harbin skull didn't just offer new anatomy, it offered new context. For decades, scientists had taught that human lineages originated solely in Africa and spread outward, but this skull hinted at something more intricate, a possibility that the mysterious shared ancestor of Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans might have existed across multiple regions, not just one. If true, the human story wasn't a simple tree trunk branching upward. It was a web of roots intertwining across continents. When the studies finally appeared in 2021, headlines announced a newly identified closest relative of modern humans, maybe even closer than Neanderthals. But scientists were far more careful. Without DNA from the Harbin skull, the claims remained educated guesses built on shape and structure. Still, the face of the skull echoed traits seen in other Chinese fossils, like those from Dali and Jinyoshan, similar, but more developed, more refined. It suggested that East Asia wasn't a distant backwater in human evolution. It was one of its central stages. The man who hid the skull in the well could never have imagined that he was also hiding a question meant for the future. Who were we before we became modern humans? And did that transformation begin in one place? Or was it already happening everywhere long before we drew borders on maps? The rediscovery of the Harbin skull reopened that question, not to define a new species, but to understand our connections. For years, each major fossil discovery came with the assumption that human evolution moved outward from Africa in a clean, linear path. But this skull didn't sit comfortably on that line. It didn't disprove the out-of-Africa model. Africa is still the birthplace of Homo sapiens, but it complicated the story that came before us. It suggested that long before our species emerged, humans were already migrating between continents, mixing and separating over hundreds of thousands of years. For scientists, that idea is both thrilling and humbling. It reminds us how fragile our reconstructions are, how a single skull can force textbooks to be quietly rewritten. For every bold headline, there are 10 careful corrections scribbled into lab notes. And the Harbin skull, still silent after all those years underground, made one of the loudest corrections in recent memory. If you held it in your hands, you'd notice its weight, nearly a kilogram heavier than a modern skull. Its thick cranial vault suggests a life in harsh cold, perhaps in northern China, during glacial pulses of the Pleistocene. The large nasal cavity hints at breathing icy air, and yet its brain size, around 1,400 cubic centimeters, reveals a mind fully capable of complex thought. This wasn't a brute. It was a human shaped by wind, ice, and survival, maybe staring at the same moon we see today, wondering what lay beyond the river. The debate now isn't just what to name it. It's where it belongs in the tangled story of the genus Homo. Species lines were never sharp. They're blended, shifting, and often imaginary. Names like Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo antecessor try to capture transitions that were anything but simple. And the Harbin skull rests uneasily among them, too advanced for erectus, too primitive for sapiens. It sits in the doorway between the past we think we understand and the past we're only beginning to rediscover. In many ways, this fossil is the physical expression of the gap we call Ancestor X, the unseen point in our evolutionary network where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans once crossed paths. To untangle relationships like these, scientists lean on both anatomy and mathematics. They measure every contour, the curve of the forehead, the angle of the jaw, the width of the palate, and feed those traits into computational models that test how closely different species resemble one another. When the Harbin skull was analyzed this way, it didn't cluster with Neanderthals at all. Instead, it grouped with fossils thought to represent early East Asian humans. That suggested that at least one branch of our family tree had been evolving alongside us in parallel, possibly mixing with our own lineage later on. The world hundreds of thousands of years ago was far less isolated than we tend to imagine. Continents weren't just connected by land bridges, but by shared ancestry. Every fossil carries bias, not personal bias, but the bias of survival. Bones are preserved only through a chain of accidents. The Harbin skull endured because it slipped into river sediments, became buried, compacted, and sealed before nature could erase it. Most of our ancestors weren't preserved with such luck. That's why each discovery feels enormous and incomplete at the same time, a single surviving page from a book whose remaining chapters are missing. The mistake would be to assume that page holds the entire story. The wiser approach is to see it as proof that a story once existed. When researchers examined the skull under the microscope, they found dense cortical bone and signs of slow development, traits that suggest long maturation periods, possibly even extended childhoods. That matters. Longer juvenile stages tend to coincide with increased learning and more complex social behavior. If these people raised children slowly, they may have shared something deeply human with us: patience. Evolution, like raising a child, rewards patience over brute force. It's tempting to romanticize fossils, to imagine their owners staring into the flames at night, pondering mysteries we still ask ourselves, but we have to resist that comfort. The individual represented by the Harbin skull lived in a world we can barely reconstruct, a landscape shaped by shifting rivers, advancing glaciers, and other hominins moving through the same territory. We don't know whether this person belonged to a group that spoke, strategized, or mourned. All we truly know is that they survived long enough to leave behind a fragment strong enough to reach us. In scientific circles, the Harbin skull helped spark what some call the Asian Renaissance in human origins research. For much of the last century, East Asian fossils were underrepresented in global discussions. But new technologies, CT scanning, isotope dating, and digital reconstruction have changed that landscape. Today, fossils like Harbin's communicate across borders, pushing collaboration instead of competition. Each measurement from the skull echoes through international databases, shifting timelines from Europe to Siberia. There's a quiet irony in that. Once hidden during a time of war to keep it out of foreign hands, the skull now demands global cooperation. The same fossil once shielded from colonial possession now unites scientists from Beijing, London, and beyond. People comparing scans, sharing data, and turning ancient bone into collective knowledge. In that sense, the Harbin skull isn't just a relic of evolution, it reflects the nature of science itself, delicate, rediscovered, and built on trust. Still, uncertainty remains. Some scientists question whether Homo longi deserves recognition as its own species. Without DNA, its position in the human family tree will always be somewhat uncertain. Others warn against naming every unusual fossil as a new species, suggesting that many of these differences represent moments in a continuum rather than cleanly separated categories. All of them may be right. Science isn't about constructing monuments to certainty. It's about testing what holds up when ideas collapse. What makes the Harbin skull unforgettable is how it restores our humility. It reminds us that evolution isn't a straight road ending with us. It's a landscape full of experiments, most of which failed or disappeared. For every lineage that flourished, dozens vanished. For every adaptation that worked, countless didn't. And within those failures lies meaning. Survival tells a story not of superiority, but of circumstance and change. If you could stand beside that old well in 1933 and watch the worker lower the skull into the darkness, you might wonder what moved him. Was it fear, reverence, or simply an instinct to protect something ancient from a world at war? Decades later, when his family finally brought it back to daylight, the world had changed, but the questions had not. Who were we? Where did we come from? And how many versions of us existed before the one we know? The Harbin skull doesn't answer those questions, it complicates them. But by complicating them, it pulls us closer to the truth, not by filling the gaps, but by showing how vast those gaps still are. Maybe that's its beauty, a reminder that knowing less can sometimes lead us toward understanding more. Today, the skull rests in a museum in Shenyang, preserved with care, scanned in exquisite detail, and studied by researchers around the world. Its shape can now be rotated and measured in virtual space, sent digitally across continents. Yet no scan can mimic what it feels like to hold it. The weight of time concentrated in bone, standing before it, you face the outline of a human who may not share our words or our name, but almost certainly shared our curiosity. Whether Dragon Man was our cousin, our ancestor, or simply another branch that winter eventually erased, his survival tells us one simple truth. Even after decades in darkness, evidence finds its way back to the surface. It waits for us to listen. And if you're the kind of person who finds comfort in understanding how things came to be, from ancient skulls to the stars, this is a place for you to slow down and breathe, If you want to help other restless thinkers find these quiet stories, a like or subscribe goes further than you think. It keeps calm curiosity alive on a very loud internet. Tell me in the comments, do you listen at night while working, or drifting in your headphones somewhere between both? And if you fall asleep halfway through, the timestamps will be here when you return. Stay curious, stay calm. What if I told you your body carries memories older than bones, not the kind you write or carve, but the quiet code inside every cell, a record of survival stretching back millions of years? If DNA remembers almost everything, why can't it remember the beginning? That paradox is at the heart of modern genomics. The deeper scientists study our genome, the more they uncover traces of others, and the more invisible our own origin becomes. When the first fragments of ancient DNA were pulled from fossil bones decades ago, it seemed impossible such fragile molecules could last for hundreds of thousands of years, yet they did. In that molecular dust lay a hidden archive, every mutation, every inheritance, every migration preserved in chemical silence. And once computers learned how to read that archive, something remarkable appeared. Our history wasn't a straight line. It was a braided river of genomes, splitting, merging, and drifting through time. Comparative genomics originally aimed to measure distance, how far we stood from our closest relatives, but distance was only half the truth. By comparing ancient DNA with the genomes of living humans, scientists could map when populations diverged, when they met again, and when their genes braided into ours. These moments aren't abstract, they're echoes of real events that reshaped what it meant to be human. Somewhere inside all that data, researchers found a shadow, evidence of a population that must have existed, but whose bones have never been found. They called it, informally, the ghost lineage. Every genome is a time capsule. The mutations inside you didn't appear overnight. They accumulated slowly, generation by generation, like stars forming in a dark sky. By counting how many genetic changes two lineages share, scientists can estimate when their last common ancestor lived, a technique known as the molecular clock. It doesn't tick in years, but in mutations. But then something unexpected surfaced. The timelines derived from genetic data didn't always match those built from fossils. As more DNA was sequenced, from modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and diverse populations, the story grew more tangled. Instead of a single clean split between archaic humans and modern humans, the data showed several phases of separation and reunification. Populations drifted apart 500,000 years ago, then mixed again 200,000 years later. Others never fully separated at all. It was like listening to a choir whose voices kept harmonizing even as they moved apart. A major breakthrough came when scientists shifted from studying whole genomes to analyzing the frequencies of specific genetic patterns, tiny motifs that reveal how ancient populations were structured. Using sophisticated models, they ran millions of simulations to test which evolutionary histories best matched real genetic data. From that statistical haze emerged a clear signal. Long before modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans branched into their distinct lines, there had been at least one earlier population. It contributed DNA to all three, but left no direct descendants we can identify. Its genetic echo appears faintly everywhere, dominant nowhere, like the missing trunk of a tree whose branches survived while the center vanished. This realization quietly reshaped evolutionary genetics. It showed that the story of humanity is not a single chain, but a mosaic created by small groups repeatedly splitting and reconnecting as climate and geography shifted. Some endured, most disappeared. What we call Homo sapiens is simply one survivor carrying fragments of many others. When scientists search for the beginning of our species in DNA, they never find one starting point. They find a web, a gradual gathering of relationships that slowly formed something recognizably human. Ancient DNA has revealed just how stubborn genetic memory can be. Even after tens of thousands of generations, tiny remnants of archaic DNA still sit inside us, passed down quietly through countless births. Some of these inherited genes shape our immune systems, some influence how our bodies process food, and others affect how we handle temperature or high altitude. They're living proof that ancestry isn't just a philosophical idea, it's a biological fact. And their presence also highlights what's missing. These fragments point toward entire populations that once existed, but whose bones have never been found. To understand how scientists detect these ghost lineages, imagine a branching tree made of DNA sequences. When we compare modern human genomes with Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, most branches appear exactly where we expect them to be. Neanderthals cluster closer to us than Denisovans do, for example. But sometimes, certain genetic sequences fall far outside the expected pattern. They diverge too early, or they blend features in ways that don't fit any known branch. Those oddities are signals. When enough of them show up, they build a statistical case that an unknown population must have contributed genes to both lineages, a population with no fossils, a population that exists only in the data. These patterns first appeared in studies of African genomes. Researchers found that some DNA segments in different African populations were far older than the others, so ancient they must have come from a lineage that split off nearly 1 million years ago. These segments weren't random noise. They appeared again and again in specific regions of the genome, pointing to ancient interbreeding with a long-vanished group of archaic humans who once lived alongside the ancestors of modern Homo sapiens, leaving behind a tiny but lasting legacy. The same thing happens outside Africa. In people living in parts of Asia and Oceania, small percentages of DNA trace back to Denisovans. And within that Denisovan DNA, even older signals appear, hinting at interbreeding with populations older still. It's as though every generation carried forward scraps of deep history without ever knowing that they themselves were walking archives. The deeper scientists search, the more of these ghosts emerge. Not supernatural apparitions, but faint statistical signatures of real people whose bodies have disappeared forever. Modern computing is what made this possible. A single human genome holds over 3 billion base pairs. Compare hundreds of them at once, and the number of possible evolutionary trees reaches into the billions. Today, advanced algorithms sift through that enormous genomic forest, searching for the most realistic paths of inheritance, like following the twists of a river back to a spring no one can see. Even so, the models hit a limit. Past roughly 1 million years, the signal weakens, DNA breaks down, molecular memory becomes static, and somewhere just beyond that horizon lies the beginning, out of reach, erased not by ignorance but by chemistry. What's most humbling is realizing how much of our story will always be missing. DNA can tell us when populations met or drifted apart, but it can't tell us what they believed, how they survived, or whether they comforted their children under the same night sky we see now. For that, we turn to archaeology, the bones, tools, and dwellings that fill in what genetics cannot. But without DNA, we would never have known that so many lineages existed at all. In that way, molecular evidence becomes the only voice for people whose skeletons are long gone. When researchers first pulled ancient DNA from a Neanderthal bone in the late 1990s, it seemed like a one-off triumph. 2 decades later, entire libraries of ancient genomes exist, and they speak. They show us that humans have always been mixed. Purity, in any sense, is a myth. We are a species built from constant blending, sometimes chosen, sometimes forced, sometimes accidental. Every interbreeding event added resilience, diversity, and occasionally heartbreak. The ghosts in our genomes aren't something to fear, they're evidence of evolution improvising its way forward. It's tempting to believe that technology gives us control over the past, but the truth is that it deepens the mystery. Each genome we sequence grows our ignorance faster than our knowledge. Every new trace of a ghost lineage reminds us that the start of our story is still hidden behind the fog of time, and may always be. And maybe that's what keeps science alive, the understanding that some questions are meant to be asked again and again, reshaped every time we discover something new. If you could hear your DNA as sound, it wouldn't play a single melody. It would be a layered chorus. Some voices ring clearly, others whisper, but every one of them matters. Within that chorus are the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the unnamed ancestors who came before both, and the countless lost populations whose only remaining footprint is a mutation you still carry. Your body is literally their archive. Genomics has shifted the search for our origins from looking for a single fossil to reconstructing relationships. It's moved us from stones to sequences. The question is no longer who came first, but how many survived long enough to leave a trace. In that sense, the story of Ancestor X is less about discovery and more about recovery, a slow gathering of the threads that time has nearly erased. Each analysis adds another thread, even though the full picture may never return. For scientists, that uncertainty isn't discouraging, it's inspiring. Knowing we may never reach the absolute beginning doesn't stop the search, it enriches it. Knowledge grows not by final answers, but by refinement. Throughout our genomes, the evidence whispers that evolution was never a clean handoff from one group to the next. It was a constant dialogue, populations adapting, meeting, blending, and fighting to survive. The ghost lineages remind us that extinction and survival always stood side by side, and the line between them was drawn not by destiny, but by chance. So when you hear that fragments of ancient humans live inside your DNA, remember this: they're not anomalies. They are continuity. They are pieces of an inheritance that began long before our species had a name. We carry the echoes of convergence, the biological memory of countless encounters deep in time. Maybe that's the real beginning, not a single ancestor, but the first moment when two lineages crossed paths and exchanged more than survival. The first quiet conversation written in code, carried forward until it became thought, imagination, and eventually us. And that, as far as our data can reach, is where the trail fades, not because the story ends, but because the rest of it is still unfolding inside our cells. Now imagine this: the planet's rhythm slows. The familiar pulse of ice and thaw that had repeated every 41,000 years starts to stretch, stagger, and break its timing. Seasons shift their balance, and the climate's clockwork rewrites itself. Around 900,000 years ago, Earth slipped out of harmony with its own history. Ice that once came and went like breath began to stay. It thickened, spread, and learned patience. The quick winters and brief, warm recoveries of the past transformed into long, punishing glacial ages lasting nearly 100,000 years each. This quiet rearrangement of orbit, ice, and atmosphere reshaped every ecosystem on the planet, and with it, every path life could take. For almost 2 million years before that, the world had moved to the same precise beat. Ice sheets advanced and retreated in steady cycles, guided by the small shifts in Earth's tilt and wobble, what scientists call Milankovitch cycles. These astronomical patterns regulate how much sunlight different regions receive. When Earth tilted more steeply, summers grew warm enough to melt glaciers. When the tilt shallowed, winters sharpened and ice returned. It was reliable. Every 41,000 years, ice breathed in and out. Forests shrank and expanded, deserts advanced and retreated, and early humans adapted to this rhythm, following green corridors that opened during each warmer pause. But then something changed deep within the climate system. The mid-Pleistocene transition, spanning from about 900,000 to 600,000 years ago, wasn't a single moment, but a long hesitation. Earth's orbit didn't snap into a new pattern overnight. Instead, the climate machinery that translated orbital cycles into temperature began to behave differently. Ice in the north piled higher, reflecting more sunlight and trapping the planet in deeper freezes. Ocean currents shifted and pulled heat away from the poles more efficiently. Carbon dioxide dropped lower than before, weakening each glacial retreat. The old 41,000-year rhythm fractured and gave way to a slower, harsher cycle, nearly 100,000 years between full thaws. To understand how dramatic this was, imagine time itself slowing. In the earlier world, an entire landscape could transform within the lifetime of a species. Grasslands could turn to forests and back again over a few thousand generations. After the transition, the cold lasted long enough to erase memory. Rivers froze, ecosystems collapsed. Warm-adapted species saw their ranges shrink like a breath turning to frost. For the first time in Earth's history, ice didn't just visit, it dominated. Massive continental glaciers swelled across what is now North America and northern Eurasia. As each ice sheet expanded, sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, exposing continental shelves and creating temporary land bridges. These openings allowed animals and early humans to migrate into new areas, but they blocked other paths. As ice and permafrost tightened their grip, tropical zones narrowed. Rainforests in Central Africa and Southeast Asia turned into patchworks of woodland and grassland deserts pushed outward. The map of the planet redrew itself again and again, reshaping the rules of survival. Where glaciers ground mountains into dust, new plains emerged, barren but rich in minerals, waiting to be rearranged by wind and water. Rivers changed course, delivering meltwater and sediment into dry basins that briefly bloomed before freezing over again. Lakes appeared and vanished in geological heartbeats. Even the Sahara, now imagined as timeless desert, switched between arid dunes and vast freshwater savannas, depending on the shifting rhythms of rainfall. The oceans changed too. Warm passages closed, while cold currents deepened, altering how heat circulated across the planet. The North Atlantic grew saltier and heavier, pulling surface water downward and strengthening the global conveyor belt that still shapes our climate. In the Pacific, nutrient-rich upwellings shifted, transforming marine productivity. Cooler phases dimmed plankton blooms, reducing oxygen in deep waters and rewriting the chemistry of the seas. On land, the effects were equally sweeping. Species tied to narrow habitats vanished as their environments collapsed. Survivors developed flexibility, the ability to migrate, endure scarcity, or wait out long winters. Large herbivores roamed vast distances, tracking grasslands and the melting edge of ice. Predators followed. Eurasia and Africa became mosaics of refuges and dead zones, pushing constant movement. Every glacial surge scraped away soil and vegetation. Each retreat left behind a raw canvas for new ecosystems. Evolution sped up, not because life flourished, but because instability demanded adaptation. The creatures that survived were the ones capable of living across extremes, cold and warm, forest and steppe, feast and famine. The slow 100,000-year rhythm became an evolutionary sieve, selecting for endurance, versatility, and intelligence. Sediment cores pulled from the ocean floor reveal this transformation layer by layer. Dust, ash, and microscopic fossils record each shift in temperature, each advance of ice, each drop in carbon dioxide. Oxygen isotope ratios map the rhythm of glacial and interglacial phases with stunning precision. Before 900,000 years ago, the peaks and troughs are frequent but shallow. After the transition, they deepen dramatically. The planet had entered a colder, drier, far more unpredictable mode. Why it happened is still debated. Some scientists point to slow cooling of the oceans as drifting continents changed the planet's heat balance. Others suggest that thickening ice sheets eroded crust in ways that influenced volcanic activity and carbon cycles. A small nudge in one feedback loop could have cascaded across the whole system, locking Earth into a longer, more intense rhythm. What's clear is that the change was gradual, a long negotiation between sunlight, rock, water, and atmosphere, with life trapped in between for the hominins already roaming the Earth. This shift was nothing less than an existential threat. They watched familiar landscapes vanish, rivers dried, Animals they depended on wandered beyond reach. Green corridors that once linked regions were swallowed by ice, isolating populations for tens of thousands of years. Elsewhere, new land appeared where oceans had retreated. Migration stopped being a choice. It became the only way to survive. Isolation reshaped them. When groups are separated long enough, their behaviors, bodies, and even the gestures they use to communicate begin to drift apart. The mid-Pleistocene transition didn't just determine where humans could live, it shaped who they could become. From a geological viewpoint, this era is the true beginning of the climate pattern that defined most of human evolution. Long ice ages followed by short bursts of warmth. Each glacial age carved its signature into the land, moraines and drumlins across the north, deep loess deposits in Asia, fossilized dune fields in Africa. Even today, the soils and minerals we depend on were arranged by glaciers that ground the planet's surface like a millstone. And yet, after every deep freeze, Earth recovered. Each rare interglacial thaw triggered a riot of life. Forests swept across continents, fish returned to the rivers, carbon dioxide rose, warming the air and melting the ice. But these warm intervals were brief compared to the long cold phases that followed. It was as if the planet had learned to ration its warmth. In this new world, landscapes were temporary, shifting, unstable. Any species tied to a fixed territory faced extinction. The lesson of the mid-Pleistocene was simple: keep moving or die. Populations that could track the shifting edges of habitable land survived. Those that stayed rooted vanished with the glaciers. From space, if anyone had been there to look, Earth during this era would have appeared like a living experiment in climate engineering. Ice sheets surging outward and shrinking back, deserts expanding and contracting, oceans darkening and brightening like lungs filling and emptying. But on the ground, it must have felt endless. Generations born and buried under grey skies, never knowing warmth would one day return. For scientists today, this ancient restructuring remains one of the most fascinating mysteries in climate history. It marks the moment when Earth's climate system stopped behaving in a linear, predictable way and became something far more sensitive, capable of shifting into entirely new states from the smallest push. Understanding that shift isn't just a journey into deep prehistory, it's a reminder of how delicate our world has always been. We live in the long shadow of that great adjustment, inside a system that still carries its imprint. The same cycles that shaped the world of early humans are the ones now accelerating toward our future, sped up by our own emissions. Standing at the edge of this knowledge, it's humbling to recognize how much all life depends on celestial geometry, the lean of Earth's axis, the stretch of its orbit, the faint change in sunlight measured in watts per square meter. A few degrees one way or the other, a shift of a few thousand years, and the planet becomes a garden or a tomb. So when Earth changes tempo, when its rhythm alters, everything that responds to that rhythm must shift along with it. Forests, oceans, winds, and the creatures walking under them all learn a different way to survive. We may never understand every mechanism behind that ancient transformation, but its effects echo in fossils, in ice, and in every inhale we take today. The mid-Pleistocene transition wasn't a catastrophe. It was a reawakening. The planet learning new ways to store cold. Imagine the world caught in a long inhale of ice. Across the northern hemisphere, glaciers thickened mile by mile, swallowing valleys, pressing down entire plains, locking rivers beneath frozen weight. The sound of the planet changed. Forests quieted, seas pulled back, and winds took their place. Between 800,000 and 700,000 years ago, Earth entered a colder period than anything it had ever experienced. But life didn't vanish. It shifted, it shrank, it adapted, and it waited. In the thin fractures between frost and drought, small groups of humans, or the beings who would eventually become human, survived. These slivers of safety became what scientists now call refugia, pockets of livable climate surrounded by regions sliding toward extinction. Finding those places requires imagining a map nothing like today's. The Sahara wasn't a sea of dunes, but a patchwork of dust plains and seasonal grasslands that appeared and disappeared with each glacial pulse. The Mediterranean basin sat half-emptied, its shores a maze of salt flats. Europe and northern Asia lost their great forests, replaced by frozen steppes where mammoths and steppe bison roamed. Meanwhile, the tropics dried and splintered, their rainforests shrinking into isolated green islands surrounded by savanna. Even Africa, the so-called cradle of humanity, wasn't a safe haven, but a land divided, parched in the north, green only along scattered rivers and highlands. Yet life held on within these fragments. Pollen, trapped in ancient lake beds, still carries the signature of survival. In East Africa, lakes in the Rift Valley shrank and refilled again and again. Each low stand shows droughts that lasted for centuries, squeezing entire ecosystems into narrow margins of wetland-hugging mountain slopes. These thin belts were lifelines for plants, animals, and early humans. The Ethiopian highlands, high enough to capture moisture when everything else dried, may have stayed stable through even the harshest glacial peaks. Farther south, the Cape region likely served as another sanctuary. Its geography trapped ocean fog and seasonal rain, preserving pockets of evergreen woodland even during the coldest phases. Those small forests supported grazing animals and the foragers who followed them. If we picture these early humans, they lived in cycles of scarcity, learning to move along rocky coasts, collect shellfish, scavenge after larger predators, and stretch every resource across long, lean seasons. Their survival depended on reading a landscape that changed constantly. Across the Red Sea, the Levant offered similar shelters. That narrow bridge between Africa and Eurasia shifted between rainy and dry phases, shaping a landscape that appeared and vanished like a mirage. Caves in modern Israel and Jordan contain layers of ancient ash and charcoal, proof that fire still burned even in the coldest ages. People living near the Jordan Valley or along the Mediterranean coast experienced softer winters and migrating herds, but their survival depended on balance. Too far north lay ice, too far south lay dust. Only a slim corridor offered enough stability for life. To the east, the Indian subcontinent held its own scattered refuges, mostly along monsoon-fed regions that never fully dried out. During the mid-Pleistocene transition, monsoon rains weakened under the growing pull of global ice, but they never shut off. Periodically, heavy rains carved fertile paths along the Narmada and Ganges valleys, while upland plateaus offered shelter from flooding ancient soils preserved there, layers of red, iron-rich dust alternating with dark, organic earth, record the heartbeat of a shifting climate, marking when life flourished and when it contracted again. Even farther east, Southeast Asia stayed a patchwork of hidden refuges tucked inside tropical forests. With sea levels dropping, the islands of Indonesia merged into the vast subcontinent of Sundaland. During glacial lows, this region became one of the richest refuges on the planet, a tangle of rivers, coasts, and forested hills. Heavy rains continued here even as global temperatures plunged. Fossils from caves across the region show continuous habitation, evidence that some populations never felt the worst of the freeze at all. For them, the global ice age was a distant rumor. Their struggles were with heat, wild monsoons, and shifting shores. All of these places, Africa's highlands, the Levant's valleys, India's river basins, and the forests of Southeast Asia, acted as biological and cultural greenhouses. Groups trapped inside them faced different evolutionary pressures. Over time, those pressures shaped their bodies, behaviors, and tools in distinct ways. Where the land was generous, people experimented, developing new ways of shaping stone and new forms of cooperation. Where the land offered almost nothing, creativity became a matter of survival, rationing water, sharing food, traveling farther than before. Evolution rarely thrives in comfort. It grows at the edges. Even on continents, the pattern of island biogeography applies. Each refuge was its own island of survival, surrounded by harsh terrain, When the climate warmed briefly, these islands reconnected. People exchanged genes, tools, and ideas. Then the cold returned, and they were separated again. Across hundreds of thousands of years, these cycles of isolation and reunion produced a network of microevolutions, local adaptations that later shaped the broader diversity of humankind. Ironically, the world's great freeze may have been what made humans so flexible in the first place. Sediment cores from the Arabian Sea record these rhythms with stunning clarity. When monsoon winds strengthened and carried nutrients into the ocean, layers rich in plankton fossils formed. When the land dried out and dust replaced rain, those layers thinned. Each shift mirrors the rise and fall of life on land. Climate, ocean, and biology were locked in one long conversation, and every organism answered in its own way. In the caves of coastal East Africa, microscopic studies of stone tools show how people responded to stress. Tools became smaller, sharper, more efficient, built to conserve scarce resources. Survival itself was being redesigned. Those who lived through these cycles didn't just learn to gather or hunt. They learned to anticipate, to store food, to plan months ahead, to think in terms of seasons and absences. In this way, even abstract thought, strategy, foresight, imagination, was shaped by geography. Where the climate swung between extremes, minds learned to swing too, between fear and invention. There is no single story of these people, no faces, no names, only the traces their world left behind. Isotopes locked in rock, stalagmites growing drip by drip, pollen sealed inside layers of ancient mud, the quiet chemistry of old soil. Every one of these traces is a whisper from a vanished world saying, "Life held on here." Scientists gather these whispers and stitch them into maps of rainfall, temperature, and vegetation from ages long gone. What emerges are streaks of green across a planet otherwise pale and frozen, the last pockets of warmth and water. When you walk through those maps in your mind, you realize survival was never global. It was local, fragile, and sometimes a matter of sheer luck. And if you look at the modern world closely, you can still see the shadows of those ancient refuges. Today's biodiversity hotspots, places overflowing with species found nowhere else, often sit right on top of the same regions that once stayed livable during Earth's great freezes. Mountains that sheltered early humans now protect rare plants and animals. The resilience that exists in these places is older than our species itself. The Ethiopian highlands, South Africa's coastal forests, Borneo's rainforests, Java's cavern systems, each of them is a living echo of stability in a world that refused to stay stable. The idea that thought itself survived in these pockets isn't poetry, it's evolutionary reality. Across continents, populations isolated for tens of thousands of years were solving different problems but reaching toward the same cognitive destination, a brain skilled in adaptation. In every refuge, problem-solving evolved on its own path, shaped by the pressures of that particular environment, yet converging toward the same human essentials: abstraction, memory, cooperation. Parallel evolution under stress is one of nature's quiet miracles. When the climate finally began to warm, glaciers pulled back and deserts softened. Rivers swollen with meltwater carved new routes, and people followed them. Groups once separated by entire climates began to move again. They traveled with more than their DNA. They carried their strategies, their learned behaviors, the memory of endurance. When these groups met after tens of thousands of years apart, they would not have recognized one another, but the rhythm of survival they shared was the same. From those encounters, the next chapters of human history would unfold. What the mid-Pleistocene cold scattered, the returning warmth slowly reassembled. But something irreversible had taken place. The planet had tested its inhabitants, and only a few held on in the narrow margins left open by the climate. Every species that followed, including us, descends from those who survived inside those shrinking shelters of ice and drought. Their persistence was rehearsal for every future challenge life would face. Maybe that is the message woven into the record of climate and time. Intelligence isn't separate from the environment, it's shaped by it. Every idea, every moment of curiosity, every spark of innovation comes from a lineage that learned to keep thinking even when the world froze. And as our own climate shifts faster than ever, it's worth remembering that survival has never belonged to the strongest or the biggest, but to the ones who could still imagine when the horizon turned to ice. Imagine a night without a moon, 800,000 years ago. Wind sliding across a shallow lake in what is now the northern Jordan Valley, the cold sharp enough to sting. Somewhere in the dark, the soft crackle of something unnatural breaks the silence. Not lightning, not wildfire, but something smaller, steadier. A handful of early humans sit around the glow of a flame that doesn't die when the wind rises. In that circle of trembling light, a new kind of mind is being tested. At Gesher Benot Yaakov, an ancient lakeshore now buried under silt, archaeologists found a thin black band of carbon and ash caught between layers of clay. At first glance, it's barely noticeable, just a faint stain. But under a microscope, it becomes a story of intention. Wood charcoal split by heat, plant fibers warped by flame, fish bones cooked at specific temperatures, stone tools resting exactly where hands left them. All of it dates to around 780,000 years ago. And for the first time in the archaeological record, fire is not an accident. It's company. Before this period, fire in human evolution appeared randomly. Lightning strikes, patches of burned earth, bits of bone scorched by natural blazes. But what makes Gesher Benot Yaakov remarkable is the repetition. Fire shows up again and again across multiple layers, each one with the same pattern. Concentrated hearth-like clusters, reused spaces, and remains of plants and animals altered by gentle, controlled heat. Whoever lived there didn't just know how to use fire, they knew how to keep it. This is the moment when technology stopped being something external. A stone tool can be crafted and abandoned. Fire must be nurtured. It requires attention, shielding from wind and rain, and a mental map of how to revive it. Controlling fire means thinking ahead, planning for the night, anticipating loss, remembering where the coals are buried. The embers at Gesher Benot Yaakov weren't only the first hearths, they were the first clocks. The site, perched along the shore of ancient Lake Hula, sat at a crossroads of ecosystems. Fossil pollen tells of dense stands of oak and olive nearby, while charred seeds and shells reveal a thriving wetland. These early humans fished along the banks, gathered nuts, and hunted large animals moving through the brush. In such a mosaic landscape, fire was tool and signal, a way to drive herds, clear undergrowth, cook food, ward off predators. Seasonal shifts made naturally sparked fires rare, which suggests that these groups either carried embers from one blaze to the next or mastered the art of preserving them through storms and dry spells. One of the most striking discoveries is the range of burned materials. Seeds from marsh plants, nutshells, and wood fragments from several tree species all show burn patterns consistent with low, steady flames, nothing like the chaos of wildfires. This points to tradition, not accident. Generations tending and teaching the craft of keeping fire alive. Whether they could strike sparks themselves remains an open question, but the unbroken chain of hearths suggests a cultural memory older than language itself, taught through gesture, imitation, and ritual. Other sites tell similar stories from the same era. In northern China, ash layers and heated sediments appear at Zhoukoudian, where early humans lived among permafrost. In Europe, younger but related evidence emerges at places like Terra Amata and Beech's Pit. Taken together, these traces show that fire mastery wasn't a single breakthrough by one lineage, but a shared response to the same global challenge. As the world grew colder, survival depended on what you could create, not just what you could find. Controlled fire changed everything. It softened tough roots, extended daylight, hardened wooden tools, preserved meat, and offered warmth in lethal climates. But its greatest impact was invisible. It changed how humans understood time. To keep a flame alive, you had to see beyond the present moment. You had to protect the coals through sleep, gather fuel before darkness, anticipate storms. Fire demanded foresight the same way the shifting climate did. In that sense, fire didn't just warm bodies, it reshaped minds. Magnetic analysis of the burned layers at Gesher Benot Yaakov shows distinct fire events clustered in the same places over long spans of time. This suggests people return to specific spots again and again, evidence of spatial memory and perhaps the earliest sense of home, not permanent villages, but circles of light cut from the darkness. Even the fish bones tell a story. Under a microscope, their fractures show they were exposed to temperatures between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius, ideal for cooking, far too low for natural wildfire. These were meals prepared with intention, by people learning to shape heat as carefully as they shaped stone.